The next speaker is from the International Service for Human Rights. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner. ISHR shares your concern at the worsening use of counter-terrorism laws and measures to criminalise human rights defenders in all regions. In Chile, the Anti-Terrorist Act has been used to prosecute indigenous activists campaigning against major development projects. In China, a draft law defines terrorism so broadly as to include thought, speech or behaviour that seeks to influence national policy making. In Egypt, Law 8 of 2015 allows the terrorist designation of individuals and associations which infringe public order or harm national unity. And in the United States, NGOs have warned that efforts to combat extremism do not contain adequate human rights safeguards and that the imperative to counter terrorism is being used by allied states, such as Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, to justify gross civil society repression. These approaches are not only incompatible with human rights standards, but are also counterproductive. Respect for the rights to freedom of expression, association, assembly and public participation is axiomatic to the realisation of our shared goals of good governance and national security. As over 30 major companies wrote in a letter to the Cambodian Prime Minister, following deadly attacks against protesting workers in 2014, respect for such rights is also a crucial factor contributing to investment and economic development. Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, against these trends we welcome a number of recent initiatives which show there is another way. In Cote we welcome a national law on the protection of human rights defenders and urge its effective implementation. In Finland, we welcome new guidelines on protecting human rights defenders through diplomatic missions and urge their principled and consistent application. And in the US, we welcome the appointment of a special envoy on LGBT rights and urge him to work in close partnership with local civil society. Finally, we welcome the High Commissioner's strong focus on protecting civil society and urge him to continue that vital independent work. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is from the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We express our deep disappointment over the deferral of the OISL report to the 30th session of this Council. We share this disappointment with several victims and human rights defenders, many who have contributed to the investigation and eagerly awaited the report as a sign of hope that transcends the vicious cycle of failed domestic accountability processes. Following elections in January, there has been a noticeable reduction in threats to human rights defenders and media freedoms. However, political prisoners and human rights defenders detained by the previous government are yet to be released, while civilians in the north and east are still subjected to intimidation and a lack of fundamental freedoms. In requesting a deferral, the High Commissioner referred to commitments set out in a 13 February letter by Sri Lanka's Foreign Minister. Unfortunately, the letter does not say that the government will cooperate with the investigation and provide access to new information, nor does it say that the human rights defenders may freely provide information to the investigation without fear of reprisals. It also does not invite the OHCHR investigation team to visit the country and collect evidence. The government of Sri Lanka must honour the trust placed in it by the High Commissioner and extend full cooperation for OISL, including free access to the country and to victims. As a token of its assurances, the government should at once release all detained political prisoners and human rights defenders. It should also demonstrate its sincerity towards change by taking immediate steps in the north and east to fully demilitarize and ensure that fundamental freedoms are restored in full. Mr. President, Resolution 25/1 came in the wake of decades of failed domestic accountability processes that extended well beyond the tenure of Sri Lanka's previous government. Brutalities of Sri Lanka's civil war addressed by the resolution are rooted in decades of failure to address root cause of conflict. Mere political transition is not necessarily a guarantee for securing human rights. In the recent past, this Council has sadly seen many examples of this, from Burma, Myanmar to Libya and the Arab Spring. It's our hope that the OSIL report will take into account this context and meaningfully establish accountability for grave human rights violations and advocate for sustained international scrutiny until tangible results are achieved. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is from the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. CIHRS welcomes the High Commissioner's update to the Council and echoes his conclusion that, quote, extremism, however repugnant, is nurtured by ideology and by alienation fed by years of tyranny, corruption, repression, discrimination, deprivation, and neglect of the legitimate rights of communities. This is particularly true of the horrifying and cruel acts of Takfiri and other terrorist groups currently operating in a number of countries across the Arab region. Violent extremism and terrorism are a threat to the security of the entire MENA region. In turn, one of the main causes of the growth of terrorism in the Arab world must also be seen as a primary threat to the stability of the region. Decades of brutal authoritarian and totalitarian policies adopted by governments in Syria, Libya, Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere, as well as the failure of the international community to find a just resolution and end abuses in the occupied Palestinian territory. These serve as a primary recruitment tool for extremist groups. Accordingly, any policies adopted or political discussions to counter terrorism in the MENA region can only be effective if at the heart of it lies concrete measures to advance human rights and the rule of law and guarantee accountability. The rights violations of governments feed the ideology of extremist groups, and in turn the brutality of such groups is used to further justify repression. Unless a way is found to break free from this ever-worsening cycle, the Arab region will continue to face crisis after crisis. To rephrase, the only way to bring about the end of conflict in the Arab region is through accountability. Impunity equals instability. As the High Commissioner said, terrorist attacks cannot destroy the values on which our societies are grounded, but laws and policies can. Mr. High Commissioner, what steps will your office take to tackle this immense task? Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is from the Comisión Mexicana de Defensa y Promoción de los Derechos Humanos. You have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to thank the Office of the High Commissioner for having raised the profile of the widespread violence that is occurring in Mexico in his written version of his report. In regard to the violence that is occurring by organized crime in connections with state security forces, we would like to bring to your attention that the Commission of Human Rights Violations has increased alarmingly since in 2006. The government introduced an open strategy of confrontation with organized crime called the War Against Drug Trafficking. This introduced de facto military control in our country throughout the national territory, and this policy placed the premises of national security over those of human rights. During the last 6-year term, 96,000 troops were involved in national security. During the first month of this new term, we have 49,000 troops. We have details of civilian victims with members of the military involved with torture, extrajudicial execution, enforced disappearance that occurred since 2006, not only in the war against drug trafficking, but in recent years and months. We would like to thank the High Commissioner for assistance in reforming legislation. In 2014, the Code for Military Justice was amended, and military can be tried by military courts. We will invite the High Commissioner to continue to monitor the situation in Mexico, particularly the systematic, widespread violations of human rights that occur in our country. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is from Liberation.
Señor presidente.
Mr. President, we have listened closely to the High Commissioner's introduction and details of his annual report, and we congratulate Mr. Said on his election. The Western Sahara is the last colony in Africa that is awaiting decolonization. The Sahrawi people are awaiting their inalienable right to self-determination embodied in just codes and standards. This right is the basis for all other human rights that are protected by this Council. As inhabitants of a non-autonomous territory, regret the refusal of the international community to implement any mechanism to not promote, just oversee human rights there. Indeed, the report doesn't mention Western Sahara, and here we recall that in paragraph 2, Article 1 of the Vienna Declaration, it is stated that human rights and fundamental freedoms are the innate heritage of all human beings, their promotion and protection, the prime responsibility of governments, end of quote. The fact that Western Sahara is in the hands of the Security Council cannot stand in the way of the High Commissioner assuming responsibility in terms of human rights in Western Sahara. Therefore, sir, we would ask you to work towards the establishment of a mechanism to oversee the situation of human rights in the Western Sahara, where the people living under illegal Moroccan occupation are subject to all types of violations of their most basic rights. Thank you.
Is from the Pasumai Tayagam Foundation.
Mr. Vice President, Pasumai Tayagam congratulates the High Commissioner on his appointment and welcomes his report. We take this opportunity to express our deep gratitude to both Mr. Zaid Rad Al-Hussein and the former High Commissioner, Madam Navi Pillai, for their important and dedicated work towards the OHCHR investigation on Sri Lanka. While we remain optimistic about the Council's commitment to accountability and justice in Sri Lanka, we share the deep disappointment and concern of war-affected communities and victims with the delay of the investigation's report. The High Commissioner's recommendation for the delay was made on the basis of a change in context in Sri Lanka and the possibility of strengthening the report, but we are concerned that the government has still not made specific commitment in cooperating with the inquiry. In order for this delay to be in accordance with the investigation's purpose of accountability and not another opportunity for impunity, the Sri Lankan government must allow a robust in-country evidence collection process, ensuring investigators, in addition to UN work groups and special rapporteurs, free and unfettered access to witnesses and victims. The delay should also not permit pressing human rights issues in Sri Lanka to go without redress for 6 months. Pressure must be placed on Sri Lankan government to take meaningful action on the release of human rights defenders like Ms. Jayakumari, the release of Tamil political detainees, the return of lands illegally acquired by the military, the resettlement of IDPs, the demilitarization of Northeast, and the de-proscription of the Tamil diaspora group. After years of failed domestic mechanism, justice delayed cannot be justice denied once more. We call on High Commissioner and the Council to ensure that the next 6 months are used to release a strong and more comprehensive report while also holding Sri Lanka accountable to address...
I'm sorry, we have to move on. Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor back to the High Commissioner. We will, around the announced time, have His Excellency Mr. Enele Sosene Sopoaga, Prime Minister of Tuvalu, and then we'll have a number of states have requested the right of reply, and that will, of course, then also take place. High Commissioner, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the representative of the ICC and then the 14 representatives who spoke either in an individual capacity or as part or representing a collection of NGOs for all their observations. There are many important points that they raised, and it's just regrettable that it all comes at the end of a very long day, because they probably merit longer responses than I'm able to give in my physical condition after 6 hours of being in this chair. But I'll try and work through them one by one. The first question that was raised concerns the Kingdom of Bahrain. Today I had a discussion earlier in the office because to me, doing this for the first time in the March session, I was trying to understand why it is that the office, how the office puts all of this report together and how we put our statement together. And perhaps there is merit in the future of thinking, and this is subject, of course, to a discussion, thinking of having a State of the World report like some prominent NGOs have, where the office basically produces an exhaustive report covering all states. So all states are assessed on the previous year's contributions to the mechanisms, if they were involved in a UPR cycle, if their midterm reports came in, reports from special procedures, and then we integrate it into a sort of single report that covers everyone. So that there isn't this impression that somehow we have unfathomable calculus where we pick on certain states to mention and we don't do with others. I will remark that we have had a very intensive discussion with the Bahraini authorities, and likewise I believe I'm the first High Commissioner for Human Rights who's met the senior leadership of two of the major opposition wings. The discussions are ongoing, and it's not for any inhibition in terms of going public. We have made public statements before, but we have a very intensive dialogue underway. On the question of Iraq and the forthcoming report to be issued and then discussed at the end of the month, whatever the contents, I've already said, both in the Human Rights Council and in the UN Security Council, that I have appealed to the Iraqi government to consider accession to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court so as to ensure that there is coverage for all alleged crimes committed on the territory of Iraq. On the issues relating to Western Sahara and MINURSO, I am at the moment, we are discussing the visit, a technical visit, that would be the first visit, I think, since the visit of the previous High Commissioner, my predecessor, and that is ongoing, and I've noted the remarks made by the two representatives who spoke on the file. On the issue of Sri Lanka, as I said when I sent the letter to the President of the Human Rights Council, the decision was taken after very careful and deep consultations with many who are involved in this. It was not an easy decision, and to a large measure it was prompted by the advice and recommendation given by the three experts, very eminent experts that we have advising the investigation. I did say that the report will be issued by the 30th session, and it will be. Finally, I was given at the end of this long day the enormous task of providing a sort of roadmap for how we deal with any exaggerated actions by governments in terms of implementing counterterrorism policies and what it will do to destroy the institutions that it seeks very much to ultimately defend. And I have spoken about this rather exhaustively. I'm not in any sort of mental state at the end of the day to go into it into great depth, but I would ask perhaps we need to have another discussion on this, and I can go to it in greater depth. Clearly, the point is that any exaggerated reactions by governments of course fuel extremism because they weaken the very institutions you seek to protect. And so we have to keep making that point over and over again. So once again, Mr. President, I thank you and I thank all the NGOs and the ICC for having taken the floor, and we will continue to dialogue with them and elaborate these thoughts further. And once again, I would like to thank all the members of the Human Rights Council, the observers, the NGOs, and the ICC for having spoken today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner. I would now like to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Enele Sosene Sopoaga, the Prime Minister of Tuvalu. As announced, welcome. So, welcome to Geneva. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. Your Excellency, Mr. President, Your Excellency, Mr. High Commissioner, distinguished members of the United Nations Human Rights Council. The Tuvalu delegation is highly appreciative for the opportunity given to make this statement at the high-level segment of this session of the Human Rights Council. We are very honored that we are recognized to say something, to contribute to the high-level segment, which we understand is focusing, amongst other things, on the impacts of climate change and human rights. Excellencies, the dangerous impacts of climate change on humankind are already happening. Throughout the world, there is evidence of untold and unprecedented destruction, threatening livelihoods and attacking the very fabrics of existence for millions of people around the world. They attack the basic rights of people, communities, and whole nations to live, to be human beings. For Tuvalu, an island atoll nation in the Pacific, the situation is extremely serious. The rights of our people to develop, to food, and to enjoy a secure and decent life are seriously compromised by the impacts of climate change, particularly sea level rise. Every single day, a child in Tuvalu is asking its mom, "Is there a future for me in Tuvalu?" Humanity must respond to these questions, and we believe we as a global family, we must save Tuvalu and island countries and vulnerable regions like Tuvalu in order to save the world. Mr. President, it is timely that this session of the United Nations Human Rights Council is focusing its attention, amongst other things, on the implications of adverse impacts of climate change on human rights. While we applaud the leadership, it has to be noted that the situation in Tuvalu and some of the islands like Tuvalu, like Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Tokelau in the Pacific, and I understand in other regions of the world, the situation on the ground is dire, requiring not further reporting and assessment, but urgent concrete actions to protect, to recover, rebuild, and to adapt, as well as to ensure the fundamental rights of those in those most vulnerable regions are protected. Tuvalu believes the outcome of this exercise cannot be simply reiterations and reaffirmations of the rhetorics made and have been heard so many times. It must help craft and project a way forward based not on saving economies and industries, but on saving human beings, saving the human race, saving the vulnerable islands like Tuvalu. The science and economics of climate change are unequivocally clear. Of course, I'm referring to the report of the IPCC fourth assessment that was issued on the eve of COP15 in Copenhagen, and also the economic assessment report by Sir Nicholas Stern that was also issued around that time, pointing out the impacts on vulnerable island countries like Tuvalu if no actions are done. And these reports have further been re-underscored again in the IPCC's fifth assessment report issued on the eve of this year, 2015. Tuvalu and small islands like it will be severely devastated, possibly totally submerged within the next 50 to 100 years, unless urgent and ambitious actions are taken by all now. The United Nations Human Rights Council must seriously consider an appropriate human response to human rights implications of the impacts of climate change, in line with the objective of and the principles enshrined in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Mr. President, the impacts of climate change for Tuvalu and many small islands, nations like Tuvalu that are totally flat, include the loss of coastal land and infrastructure due to erosion, inundation, sea level rise, and storm surges. I just came back from my own home island in Tuvalu about 3 days ago, and I was scared when I was there, seeing high seas and surges taking away valuable land from my home island. There is also an increase in the frequency and severity of cyclones and strong winds, king tides, creating risks to life, health and home, and loss of coral reefs. The loss of coral reefs due to bleaching and ocean acidification has significant food security implications. Changes in weather patterns due to climate change will also threaten freshwater supplies and create saltwater intrusion into agricultural land and extreme temperatures. Mr. President, there is a fundamental justice concern here, which is exacerbated by the fact that climate change will strain the ability of many states, especially the poorest amongst them, like Tuvalu, to uphold their human rights obligations. In our first UPR report to this very body in the year 2009, which I personally delivered, we also pointed out these very happenings to this very august body. Moreover, Mr. President, climate change also poses an effective obstacle to the continued progress of human rights. It will worsen the existing inequities that afflict a world already riven by inequality, by poverty, and by conflict. In Tuvalu, we do not have the resources nor the capacity to cope with these impacts. The impacts of climate change also interact with several global megatrends: population growth, human mobility, urbanization, as well as food, water, and energy insecurity. Climate change, we believe, acts as an impact multiplier and accelerator. Displacement is likely to be a significant consequence of global climate change processes of both a rapid and slow onset events. There is a potential that at least some of Tuvalu's population will be displaced by the impacts of climate change. In saying this, the legal principle of continuity of statehood is important. Our basic rights to survive as a sovereignty is critical and must be protected. It is also our view that any future relocation must ensure the enjoyment of the full range of relevant rights to enjoy and practice one's own culture and traditions, and to continue to exercise economic rights in their areas or countries of origins. Responses need to be guided by the fundamental principles of humanity, human dignity, human rights, and international cooperation, and by consent, empowerment, participation, and partnership. Mr. President, Tuvalu strongly believes that responding to the human rights implications of climate change can be best addressed primarily through two institutional frameworks: the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the United Nations Human Rights Council and the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights. With respect to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it is critical that the global agreement on climate change to be adopted in Paris in December must adopt urgent and ambitious mitigation actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Concrete adaptation actions, as well as strong provisions on loss and damage, including compensation for human rights infringements. We must not be any lesser ambitious. The United Nations Human Rights Council, on the other hand, we believe, should be mandated with preparing a report on measures and best practices to promote and protect human rights as a consequence of climate change. It should develop a legal instrument to address the situations of people internally and externally displaced by the impacts of climate change. The Human Rights Council and, of course, the Office of the High Commissioners for Human Rights should be mandated with the responsibility of identifying ways to enhance the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights with respect to the protection of human rights associated with the impacts of climate change. Mr. President, Excellencies, Tuvalu will be very happy to expand further on these ideas at the round-table meeting that we believe has been scheduled for this session later in the week. I thank you, Tuvalu Modetu.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and we will see each other tomorrow at the panel. I think everybody's looking forward to the full-day debate on human rights and climate change. Let me now come back to our agenda, and I understand that a few delegations have requested to exercise the right of reply. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. You have the floor, and it is 3 minutes.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. أود التعقيب على بيان.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to make some comments on the statement made by Qatar that always comes up with statements that create problems. This relates to some form of schizophrenia. Qatar is not a democratic country. Where is democracy in the constitutional system? Qatar refers to freedoms. Is Qatar a party to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights? And at the same time, does that Qatar provide adequate living conditions? No, actually it provides wonderful conditions for those individuals who incite religious hatred. And we talked about terrorism, and Qatar is fully involved in different acts of transnational terrorism that we have seen in the region: indoctrination, military training, without forgetting the role that associations play in money laundering. All of this violates resolutions of the Security Council under Chapter 7. Many of those who finance Daesh and Al-Qaeda live in Qatar. In conclusion, I'd like to say that Qatar is trying to play a role on the international level through the destruction and destabilization of other countries and the support for extremist trends. Now, as far as Turkey is concerned, I'd like to say that there's a proved link between Turkey and the Islamic State. And this is actually seen through acts of how Turkey strengthens the economy of the IS. Turkey opened its borders for the flow of oil, and something that has strengthened the economy of Daesh. How can we explain that Daesh has been destroying churches and tombs without destroying or touching the tomb of Salman al-Shah? How can we explain that Turks entered some zones that are dominated by Daesh, and all of this in full freedom without any controls over the group that carried out the attacks. Now it continues to refer to other countries, and in fact France now would like to review its own situations related to what's happening in terrorism in the country.
From Venezuela, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, sir. Venezuela was using its rights of reply to refer to the statement by the delegation of the United Kingdom, right close by me here. We regret that in this country manifestations of racism, racial discriminations persist, which are vestiges of its cruel colonial past. We regret the serious lack of protection of domestic migratory workers in that country. We are also concerned that segregation in the United Nations is practiced in particularly virulent form against ethnic minorities. There are alarming complaints of racial violence that undermine the human rights of so many innocents. The world awaits the outcomes of the investigations into the increasing number of accusations of torture and ill treatment, some in the form of complicity as the result of the illegal military intervention of the army of the United Kingdom in Iraq, in particular in the case of Bahamus and also in Afghanistan. If this government is going to teach lessons on human rights, it should begin by undertaking a public, impartial and independent investigation into who was responsible for the atrocities committed and prosecute them for the grave acts of torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment that were committed in Iraq between 2003 and 2009. We are extremely concerned that the United Kingdom continues to use techniques of coercion to inflict deliberate pain on children who are interned in institutions for young offenders, supposedly to maintain good order and discipline. An abominable practice, however you look at it. So it is immoral to accuse a country like Venezuela, where we do have full and genuine compliance with human rights, and more grave yet, if such these references are based on manipulated information without any other basis than the international media campaign that is promoted by anti-democratic and destabilizing sectors. The same cannot be said of the United Kingdom. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Qatar.
Thank you very much, President. And the desperate attempts that we have seen from the Syrian regime cannot cover up the crimes carried out by the Assad regime in Syria, and to launch accusations against Qatar. This is just an attempt that will fail, because those who represent the Assad regime here know very well that Qatar is a member of the alliance that is fighting against Daesh, the Islamic State, and we affirm our position that we will be fighting against terrorism in all of its manifestations and forms, and including the terrorism of Daesh that is reflected also in the actions of the government of Assad. Now, related to the accusations related to the violations, we have seen that it is the Syrian regime carried out these violations. We have seen that the resolutions of the Council have not...
Floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in relation to the crisis in Syria, we categorically deny the baseless allegations raised by the representative of the Syrian regime just a while ago. It constitutes yet another despicable attempt by the regime in Syria, as being the sole responsible and the root cause of the enormous destruction and human suffering in Syria, it strives for diverting the attention from the crimes it commits. Turkey has not only been a safe refuge for the 1.7 million Syrians who had to flee Syria for their lives, as the regime bent on collectively punishing the people of Syria in all impunity, but it has also ensured that cross-border humanitarian assistance reached millions of people in dire need on the Syrian side of the border, in conformity with its international obligations in support of the UN system. Under these circumstances, no one, but particularly the regime in Syria, has the right to question Turkey's efforts to give back to the Syrian people, and especially the Syrian women and children, some of the dignity and hope that they have lost due to the regime's murderous oppression. Mocking the realities and insulting the memories of thousands of innocent people in this alliance of civilizations room cannot be condoned and are no way to be compatible with the principle which this august council and the international community upholds. The only way to end this bloodshed in Syria is a genuine and inclusive political transformation on the basis of the Geneva Declaration and the legitimate expectations of the Syrian people. Otherwise, peace and stability cannot be reinstated in Syria, and this tyranny will continue, denying an opportunity for a brighter future for the Syrian people. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Egypt. You have the floor.
I thank you, Mr. President. Egypt is exercising its right of reply in response to the interventions earlier today by the delegations of the United States of America and the United Kingdom. At the beginning, let me reiterate that no one in Egypt under any circumstances is imprisoned except for committing criminal offenses under Egyptian law, including use of force and carrying licensed arms and destructing public and private property, and not for exercising, as claimed by others, their legitimate and political rights enshrined under the Constitution. The second point is to reassure that the standards of fair trial and due process are utmostly respected in Egypt, in accordance with the international human rights obligations and as enshrined under the Egyptian law and constitution. We refer both delegations to our statement earlier today in the interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner, and regret that they also based their inaccurate and misled assessment based on skewed, biased and inobjective media reports or reports from other unreliable sources. And I will seek this opportunity to conclude and say that we were looking forward that the American delegation uses the 3 minutes allocated to it earlier today to explain its positions vis-à-vis the 3 paragraphs referring to it in the statement of the High Commissioner, instead of consuming it and commenting on the situation elsewhere, including in Egypt. I thank you.
The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from the UK.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United Kingdom, being a country that abides by the rule of law, including international law, would simply like to take this occasion to refute absolutely all of the accusations just presented by Venezuela in its right of reply. Thank you.
The next speaker is Syrian Arab Republic. They take their second of reply. You have 2 minutes now.
Okay.
شكرا السيد الرئيس وأعتذر لطلب.
Thank you very much, President. I apologize for taking the floor once again, but the delegation of the regime of Qatar did not respond to a single one of the questions of that I raised, and all of the points did not respond to the points that I raised in my statement. And this reflects the schizophrenia that the regime in Qatar is suffering from. That regime is pretending that it respects other opinions, but it does not listen to the opinions of others during an interactive dialogue, presenting views that have been prepared in advance. The regime has not learned the lesson of good, normal dialogue and how views are exchanged in this council. It continues to make these provocative steps which will destroy any value that this council may have. There's no respect for the rules of the council and even the people of Qatar. Because of the possibility for terrorists to reside in Qatar. These people suffer, and I'd like to repeat once again, I will not start talking about the role of Turkey, the destructive role of Turkey in the events of in Syria. I simply want to make a reference to the connection that exists between Turkey and the Daesh movement. The mausoleum of Shah is more important than other sacred sites. Daesh has destroyed all sacred sites in Syria except the mausoleum of Salman Shah that has not been touched, and Turkish soldiers carried out an operation to save this mausoleum.
Thank you, sir. Rapidly, we would like to take the floor in right to reply to maintain and confirm everything said by my delegation regarding the serious human rights situation in the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Distinguished delegate from Qatar has asked for the floor. Second right of reply.
Thank you very much, President. I apologize for asking the floor for a second time. I would like to say that I'm simply disgusted with what has been said by the representative, an illegitimate regime that has caused to the deaths of 200,000 Syrians, and not controlling only part of the territory of Syria. Syrians have left the country. We're talking about human rights here in this council, and we are not here to receive lessons from the Syrian delegation. That is what we would call schizophrenia. Everybody knows about the chaotic situation in Syria that serves the interests of the Assad regime, and it helps the survival of the regime. And they want to show that terrorism is the evil, but in fact it is Assad who is the source of all evils that Syria is suffering from. We do not talk to killers or to a regime that lost all legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. Thank you.
The next speaker is Turkey. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I don't want to take much time at this late hour, but it is a parody of universal principles which the UN system represents, that a regime which is responsible for the lives of more than 300,000 Syrians continues to occupy a seat at the UN and still is allowing its representative to make such shameless statements and to fabricate lies. Daesh is a terrorist organization and is a direct threat to Turkey. That's why we made the recent operation conducted by the Turkish Armed Forces to relocate the Süleyman Shah Memorial Outpost, a 10-acre of land of Turkish territory inside Syria, recognized by international agreements, which was facing imminent threat from Daesh. This operation, which lasted for 9 hours, was conducted based on the rights of Turkey emanating, as I said, from international agreements and international law. The President of the Security Council and the Secretary General of the United Nations were informed of the operation the very same day after its conclusion. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. No rights of reply anymore. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the meeting. We shall reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. for the first panel of the full-day discussion on human rights and climate change, which will take place between 9 a.m. and noon. Following a lunch break, and this is a first this week, following a lunch break, which we'll have tomorrow, the second panel on human rights and climate change will then take place between 3 and 6 p.m. Before closing this meeting, I would like to remind delegations that National Day Dress Dress Day. Day dress? No, National Day? Dress Day. I'm too much reading my script, you know, I should speak. I would like to remind delegations that National Dress Day will be tomorrow. Delegations, including permanent representatives, are encouraged to wear their national dress during the whole day. There will be prizes awarded at the multicultural party later that evening in four categories. First, best male. Second, best female. Third, best permanent representative. And fourth, best coordinated delegation. 4 prizes. Ballot sheets will be distributed in the room. You can cast your vote in the ballot box at the back of room 20. Voting will close at 6 p.m. on Friday. Delegations are reminded that there is 1 vote per person. 1 vote per person. I look forward to seeing you all in the national dress tomorrow. I would also like to inform you that the booklet entitled Death Penalty Information Pack, which was distributed during the biannual high-level panel discussion on the question, is also available on the website now displayed on the screen. I hereby declare closed the 12th meeting of the 28th session of the Human Rights Council.